All right, I think we'll get started. Um, it's really a pleasure for me to introduce our dinner speaker today, Dr. Sean White. So just to give a really quick background, he's going to go through a lot of this, I think. But Sean, he got his bachelor's degree at University of Rochester in optics, and then he came here and he did his PhD it was actually this interesting PhD at the interface of biophotonics and tissue engineering. So he was co-advised by Steve George and me. Steve is now the department chair at UC Davis. He was department chair here for a while. And then after that, Sean, well, actually, I don't know how much of this you're going to talk about. So I don't want to.
You're not going to steal my thunder. Okay. Good. You'll make it sound better than I ever will.
So then, after Sean graduated, he kind of did two things at the same time. He postdoced in my laboratory and also with Elliot Botvinnik. And along the way, he also started up a company. And so he's going to talk about that and about just some of the journey with that. He's now he's a director of research and technology at Medtronic. And yeah, like I said, I'll let him talk about the rest of it. So one of the things I will say about Sean is that Sean was always one of those people that whatever he did, it was just excellent. Like he was the one, and the running joke in the lab is that he could take laser diodes, plug them in backward, it'd work better. Like that's what Sean can do. Sean just makes everything better. I'm very excited that he's here with us, and welcome him.
Thank you. Thanks, Bernard. That was way too kind. I've broken a lot of things that I've touched, so and I'm going to talk about some of them today. So for anyone's a Lord of the Rings fan, right? This is all about there and back again. So a little bit of background. Obviously, I was a grad student here. I was a postdoc here. And what I want to talk about today is kind of the upbringing within academia, moving to a startup. And a lot of this is going to be focused on this journey of what it was to be part of a startup, the fundamental problems. And a lot of this is lessons learned. And usually those lessons are through things breaking and going wrong. And then this all ended up working at Medtronic, which is where I am now. So if you're wondering why everything is branded, that is the reason. I'm now the director of research and technology at Medtronic, which means that like all the early stage R&D, like identifying problems, going out, prototyping, finding new technologies, licensing technologies, buying technologies, that's what I do now. So I'm kind of on the opposite side of the table of where I started in all of this. So it feels like a bit of a full circle. So can't start without an agenda, right? So I'll talk about what it was to start my life as an entrepreneur. I want to talk about just like some of the technical challenges that we faced along the way. I want to talk about how we grew the company and what it was to start with a napkin and kind of end with a piece of paper saying that you're going to sell the company. And then ultimately what it was like to integrate into a big company like Medtronic. And you don't make an omelet without breaking a lot of eggs, right? And so I've learned a lot of things the hard way, and I've learned some things the effective way, but I'd like to think I've learned a lot of things. So I'll share those anecdotes along the way. But I'll start with the same place that every big thing should start with, which is the beginning of the story, which is the problem here. And the kind of the impetus for all of this starting at the beginning was the problem that I was looking at, maybe 10 years ago. And I guess before I go into all the depth, anyone heard of peripheral artery disease before? Does that mean anything to anyone? All right, there's a couple people. So PAD or peripheral artery disease is like the disease that everybody knows, but they may not know that they know it. Hey, Jan. We talk about it a lot when you think of atherosclerosis, and usually people think about that as taking place in the heart. But there's actually more patients that have blockages in their legs than in the heart. So peripheral artery disease is the development of plaque, usually in the lower limbs. Plaque is composed of a lot of different things, right? There's fatty acids, calcium, all sort of fibrotic tissue, but it's stuff that blocks blood vessels. And that limits the amount of blood flow you get to the peripheral tissue. And when that gets really bad, we call it critical limb ischemia, right? So this is when you're at risk of losing tissue due to ischemia, which is not enough blood flow, not enough oxygen. And so the kind of gold standard for treatment, as it has been now for 30 or 40 years, is what's called percutaneous transluminal angioplasty, which is kind of fancy words for balloon on a stick. And so you've probably all seen this in the heart, right? But the idea is that you've got a blockage in the artery. You take a balloon, you thread it down into the artery, you inflate that balloon, and you push that plaque to the side, right? You're trying to buy yourself patency, which is you're buying lumen. You're getting yourself a larger vessel. This is obviously made by a marketing team, which is why it looks like it's covered in like really fancy pixie dust. But the magical stuff on the balloon is a drug. In this case, it's paclitaxel. It's like a cytotoxic drug to prevent restenosis, or the regrowth of tissue within that vessel. So this is how we've been doing it, plus or minus a bunch of other technologies too, for now, tens of years. And so you might expect that the outcomes are pretty good, and I'll contend to you that they are not, right? So for patients with critical limb ischemia, which is, again, this is like the worst of the worst for patients with PAD, the 1-year amputation rates are around 20%. The 1-year mortality is about a quarter of people, and then the 5-year mortality is about half of people. So I don't think you can look at any of these and say, like, if this were me, if this were someone that I know, that these are positive outcomes. No one would open up WebMD and look at this and feel pretty good about your prognosis, right? And so the question becomes, for the people that have peripheral artery disease, why are these outcomes the way that they are? And like I said, this is a very prevalent disease. So in the US, there's about 10 million people, plus or minus a couple million, who have this. Worldwide, it's about 200 million. This is not uncommon, right? A lot of people have this condition.
Sean, quick question. I know that in the heart, often they don't only do the balloon, but they also put a stent in.
Yeah.
Is there a stent associated with this procedure or not?
100%. So we've actually seen the evolution of that disease process and treatment. So when we were early days, there were stents that you would actually crimp onto a balloon and you would inflate it and leave behind a metal stent. Then we had expandable stents, which you could deploy out of a catheter, and they're usually nitinol based. They expand as you push them out of the catheter. And now there's resorbable, what we call scaffolds, not stents. So these are like drug-eluting stents or scaffolds. And the industry's kind of shifted over time. We used to just kind of stent everything, right? Because you're buying yourself that lumen. But what we've learned over time is not everything should be stented, because putting a piece of metal into a very flexible and hemodynamically active artery doesn't always result in the good outcomes. One, you get a lot of hypertrophy of the tissue, intimal hyperplasia. And furthermore, like once you put a stent in, you're basically done. You're not going back in there again. You can't pull a stent out, plus or minus a few exceptions. So it makes retreatment very difficult. And if you're a PAD patient, as things stand today, you're not cured. We're delaying symptoms. So retreatment is an important part of the game. Okay, so this kind of gets to the core question of like, okay, you told me the outcomes are bad. Why are they bad? So to answer that question, we need to look at where these treatments for peripheral artery disease take place, which is the catheterization lab, or the cath lab. And that's this image here. You can't see the laser. It's there. It's the picture, the expensive looking place. So there's a lot of stuff in that image, but really you're kind of just doing one thing, which is X-rays. X-rays, or in this case, it's called fluoroscopy. When you do it in arteries, it's angiography. But we're using X-rays to guide treatment. So you can't see a blood vessel with an X-ray, so you have to inject some sort of contrast agent. And when you do, hopefully you get an image that looks like this, right? So this is a real angiogram of a patient. This is like right below the knee. If you're paying attention to my cartoon, there should be 3 primary vessels below the knee, right? You have an anterior tibial, posterior tibial, and your perineal. There's only one there, right? So there's clearly some blockages, but there's this idea that at least I came into this industry with of like, oh, you got a blockage, you go in there and treat it. But usually when patients are treated for peripheral artery disease, you don't just have one localized blockage. It's like a systemic disease. So you've got multiple blockages in multiple locations of multiple different levels of severity. So the question isn't like, should I treat this or not? It's, where do I treat? And so that becomes a problem because you can't go in there and treat everything. It's not good for the patient. It's not good for the healthcare system. So you have to make selections about what do you do. And then the other problem is blood flow. Why? Well, I told you before that critical limb ischemia, like the bad manifestation of PAD, is the restriction of adequate blood flow. An angiogram is not a measurement of blood flow. It's a map, right? It can tell me where the narrowings are, but it doesn't tell me how much blood flow I've restored, like quantitatively. So you're in a procedure where the goal is to restore blood flow, but there is no way easily to measure blood flow. So I'll kind of drive this home with like a real world example. This is a pre and post angiogram. Again, there's a couple vessels here. The big one is like the superficial femoral artery. It's like above your knee, and then it's branching out into a couple of the arteries below the knee. So this patient had a non-healing ulcer on their big toe. And you don't need to be a doctor to look at this and be like, I see some problems, right? Like, this looks like a problem. That looks like a problem, right? Your vessel shouldn't narrow like that. So there's some plaque in there. So doctor went in there, performed some percutaneous balloon angioplasties, like we talked about earlier, did some other technologies too, atherectomy. It's like the roto-rooter of blood vessels. And here's the final angiogram of that same area, right? So it looks better, but like, is that patient's wound going to heal? You don't know, right? You don't have a measurement of blood flow. And so you can say, it looks like we've restored patency. In this case, maybe it's to the anterior tibial, but is that going to result in a good outcome for the patient? That's really up to the experience and the decision-making of the clinician. This is not quantitative, this is qualitative, right? This is a kind of convergence of art and science. So this is part of what makes treating patients with PAD hard. And I had to work in this next part too, because this is an imaging class after all, right? So I got to throw this out there in case anyone's interested. If you go into the literature, which I'm sure many of you have, you can find the first angiogram used to guide balloon angioplasty in the periphery. So it's in 1964, good old Gunsig, right? Here's a stenotic lesion. It's this guy right here, right? This is a bone in the leg that you can see. So this is state of the art, right? In 1964. This is an angiogram from, what is this, 2023. So this is from my personal library of angiograms. And I tried to pick one with a really similar looking lesion around the same anatomical location. And I think if you're in the game, right, you can see this and say, yeah, well, the noise looks like there's less noise. Resolution is increased. It looks a little better, right? But this is 60 years of innovation. So I just want to plant this in people's head. 60 years is a lot of time, right? Here's the juxtaposition. 66 years, we went from the first flight to putting someone on the moon, right? That's a lot better than images got a little clearer. So there's a lot of improvement that can be done on the imaging front too. So let's not forget that. But fundamentally, let's boil this down. I said I want to motivate this with the problem, right? And these are kind of the fundamental problems of physicians don't know, in this case, what I'm doing is working, and I don't know when I'm done. So like, give me feedback to know the thing I'm doing is restoring blood flow, and then let me know when I've restored enough of that so I can stop the procedure. So this is kind of the fundamental motivation behind what we wanted to solve. This was the problem. And our idea was to kind of burying the lead here, but we wanted to use the technology for measuring blood flow. I think, Bernard, correct me if I'm wrong, we already talked about laser speckle, right? All right. Yeah, they've seen the device. They've seen the device. All right, perfect. Well, then you really buried the lead there. So what do we want to do here? We wanted to measure blood flow, like I was saying before. And no, we're not measuring blood flow throughout the limb. We wanted to find a way to measure blood flow simply and quantitatively. And so it looks the way that it does because even though we didn't necessarily start here, and I'll talk about it for a second, there's a form factor in like a procedural workflow that every physician has, right? Every physician knows how to put on a pulse oximeter. So this was like a very natural form factor for them. And we wanted to just take a technology which we knew because I was lucky enough to work with Bernard. And so I was exposed through people smarter than me to different measurement technologies for hemodynamics like laser speckle. And so we kind of went into this and said there's a couple things we want to do. Like we want to be able to do just a flow value. Like we want to give like a hard number. Your blood flow is 5. Your blood flow is 10. Don't worry about the units. We'll talk about it later, right? But we just want to quantitate. We also wanted to do a waveform, right? So it's just like plotting the blood flow number across time. Because if anyone's used to looking at a photoplethysmography, PPG waveform, or a Doppler waveform, or an EKG waveform, like whatever it is, physicians are used to reading waveforms. So this is like a very natural evolution. And then you just want to track it over time, right? So I want to know where I started and where I ended. So this kind of turned into the idea or the impetus behind a company. And I want to talk about kind of where it started, and then ultimately we'll land at where it ended. But there's a whole lot of stuff that happened on this timeline, right? So Bernard had said, I was lucky enough to work with him and a couple other people. I was a postdoc, and it was around that time when we founded an LLC to kind of go after this problem. And who was we, right? It was myself and a couple of close friends, Tyler, Bruce, and me. Usually I have to throw this picture up because nobody knows where Beckman Laser Institute is or what it looks like. Don't have to fight that battle. But the fundamental idea was, all right, well, we're 3 people. Tyler was a physicist. Bruce and I were BMEs in background. And we said, we've worked on hemodynamic measurements, non-invasive, optical. Is there a way we can take that technology and we can apply it to our particular use case? And when we started, there was already commercialized laser speckle devices like the one you see here, right? And these are great in their own right, but there's going to be several limitations. And so I don't think I need to talk about how all of this works, right? But usually I need to tell physicians, like, what is laser speckle and how does it work, right? I'll just move through really quickly. This is how I explain it to physicians, right? Take a laser, shine it on an object, take a picture with a camera, and what happens is like something that looks very smooth, looks really bumpy on the scale of the wavelength of light. And so just like waves on a pond interfere with each other, when light does that comes from a coherent laser, what you get is the ripples interfering with one another. But when you look at it with light, it's a speckle pattern, right? But there's the same thing. It's just waves overlapping one another. Peaks and peaks, troughs and troughs, interference, right? And then if you were looking at the output from this camera and you took your object and you wiggled it around, then your speckle pattern would look like this, right? Because all the areas where those waves are overlapping, peaks to troughs, troughs to troughs, peaks to peaks, everything like that, they all change a little bit. So it's like you're kind of moving the waves around. And this is important on the scale to a physician where blood flow is, because if you were to say perform this type of measurement on 2 different places in the hand, where let's take away all the unimportant parts of your tissue and only leave the blood flow, because I love blood flow, right? Then you might expect where there's a really dense vascular network, you get a lot of movement of that speckle pattern, and where there's not, you have less. And of course, you turn this into some metric like a speckle flow index map. And I just kind of like this image because if you look at the density of vasculature and you look at this map, they map onto one another. So it seems very intuitive. All right, so that was the idea. But the challenge was we took what we knew about laser speckle, right? Which is we thought of it as big camera, complex laser system, relatively expensive. And if you try and you use that in the OR, in the cath lab, there's a lot of reasons why that doesn't fit, both literally and figuratively. So first, like a large system, I will tell you, a cath lab is busy, it's dense, it's crowded. And so like if you want to take a big cart like this size and say, I want to have this next to you, it is tough because you got an operator, you've got like a scrub tech next to them. There's not a lot of space. So to say like, hey, I want to put this thing next to you, you have a good value proposition to justify your space. Like those inches are valuable. So that's a challenge. The fact that we're all scientists and engineers makes us feel like, oh, a map of blood flow, like that's a good thing. It's a lot of information content in there. But a lot of the times, if you're a physician, more is not always better, right? And so this second bullet point I know it feels like it shouldn't be true, but too much information is like well, how good is the blood flow in that hand? That's like the question you get all the time. Oh, you got a device that measures blood flow in the leg? Here's a map of it. All right, well, is that good or bad? Why is it different in these two locations? And you're automatically like on the defense of trying to justify your technology, even though that inhomogeneity in blood flow is true, right? But how do you interpret that? How do you make that easy to comprehend and make it actionable? It's something you got to think about. Furthermore, you guys have already done modeling, so shallow depth penetration probably makes a lot of sense to you already. But keep in mind, like cutaneous blood flow within like the first millimeter of your tissue, just in your skin, that is not the same thing as systemic blood flow. If you go outside and you get a little chilly and you come inside, your cutaneous blood flow becomes constricted pretty quickly. So what you measure with a superficial technology is not necessarily representative of deeper flow. And if you're interested in deeper flow, then that's a problem, right? If anyone's played with like laser Doppler as like a point measurement, like put it on your finger and slide it like 1 millimeter down your finger and then look at all the different values you get. Your cutaneous blood flow is inhomogeneous even spatially, but then the depth becomes a problem. And then relative measurements, which I think you all understand as well, that it's all well and good to get a number out of something, but if I can't compare my number to your number to your number to your number, well, that doesn't make for a very good diagnostic, right? And so that can be challenging. So we had to solve all of these problems. And that's not necessarily part of this story, but I would love to talk about how. But if we do, we'll be in this for 45 minutes. So I'll just say, these were the challenges, and we had to solve them, and then we did. It happened. And if you have questions, I'm happy to take them. But at the end of the day, we had to build out the technology, had to build out some custom architecture, electronics, do some calibrations to try and get to kind of this end product here. And I already showed you the slide, and you guys have played with the device already, but what we found was that the flow value, the flow index, the quantification was important. An interesting anecdote, though, was I said that we wanted to get the waveform because physicians were used to seeing it. What we found was that we started this kind of idea on this hypothesis, like, gotta measure blood flow. But as it turns out, the blood flow was pretty much just important or potentially less important than the dynamics of the waveform. And so this is just like a nice cartoon to kind of tell the picture. But as it turns out, your blood flow can change for a lot of different reasons. I already kind of mentioned one, which is if you change temperatures, you can vasodilate or you can vasoconstrict. That changes your blood flow. During the course of a procedure, there are vasoactive drugs, which are used, like nitroglycerin is used all the time as a vasodilator during procedures. Well, that changes your blood flow too. And the question becomes, if I'm operating and I see a change, be it an increase or a decrease in blood flow, is that because of a disease process or is that part of my intervention? And the challenge is that you can measure blood flow and you can be 100% right in your measurement, but if you can't decouple those things, then it may not be useful to a physician. And what we found was that the flow value itself was very susceptible to all the things that change blood flow. But when you look at that number and you look at the waveform together by combining the two, it gave you a more robust metric of vascular disease. And so I'll just tell like an anecdote. Like I can go as a relatively healthy person, measure my blood flow in my finger, it looks pretty good. I can go out in the cold, become very vasoconstricted, and I'll put it on a device and it can be like 3 and it's very low. But what you'll find is my waveform, my flow waveform, pretty much always looks like this or this. I think that's actually mine. But what it never looks like is that bottom one, right? And that's because what results in that end waveform is like this convolution of different things blocking all of the blood flow. And that was kind of the magic that makes the metric work. And we didn't know that going in. That was something we had to learn through doing research. But that's what we thought. And so when we started the company, what we were doing was doing what we thought we needed to do, which like build out the technology. And it started real ugly. So like the first thing we built was basically like a tissue box that you stick your finger in, and you could essentially do transmission laser speckle on that. And we were kind of under this impression at this point, again, three good friends trying to figure this thing out together, that we needed to figure out the technology, right? Like that's going to be the biggest limitation to all of this. And that's what we knew. So a lot of our time on the front end when we're just like doing this nights and weekends, right, was like, get it smaller, get it to work better, because if we're ever going to go and raise money, that's what people care about, right? Like they want to see the thing, they want to see that it works. And that's why over the first couple of years, like all this work that we did was trying to get better at making repeatable instruments, making it smaller, building out a form factor that worked, and then taking that device and bringing it into a clinic and taking data and seeing, like, is the signal to noise good? Are we getting meaningful measurements? Do they make sense? Can we make one device that's actually equivalent to another? And in so doing, that meant we get a call upon a lot of physicians to work with. So I at some point I went back and I like did some of the math looking at my Gmail account, but we had cold called like more than 50 physicians and specialists, being like hospital administrators, nurses, techs, everyone. And we just picked up the phone and we said like, hey, we're grad students from UCI. We're starting a company. All we want to do is solve some problems. Will you meet with me? And you know what? Like of the 50 that we cold called, probably around half said, sure. Like, I'll come out to the hospital and talk to me. Like, they didn't want money. They just wanted us to help them solve the problem, right? And I will tell you, I'm kind of on the other end of the spectrum now. Pay a lot of money for that kind of time and input. And so we'll get to like the lessons learned here in a second. But that was really valuable. And those people helped us collect clinical data. They helped us set up IRB approved studies to work with patients. And we started working on intellectual property. So I sat down and started writing the first patent, which was garbage. And then I read a book on what good IP should look like. Tony Durkin, helped me from BLI, helped guide me into what a good sound set of claims should look like. And then ultimately, we had very, very little money because we're doing everything out of pocket. And I paid for like a big name law firm to put their name on the patent application. And so what did I learn through all of this? Lessons learned, right? Your professional network as a grad student is like a huge asset. Again, I cold call people and they called me back. And I think it's just because I just wanted to do something meaningful. And I will tell you, now I've got like a myname@medtronic.com, and like people will ignore the hell out of my email address now, right? So it does make a difference. And then furthermore, I didn't know it at the time, but the fact that we invested in and spent probably like 75% of our small amount of money then on IP was a good investment for us, because long term, we ended up leveraging that as an asset. And if we had weak intellectual property or patents from the beginning, it would have caused us problems down the road. We didn't know it at the time. We took a bet and said, like, we want to make sure that this is done right. And I'm glad that we did. So that's a kind of lesson I'm walking away with. All right, so here we are. We're still spending the money that we found on like the couch cushions, right? And at one point we were in the waiting room because we were going to take clinical data that day, and like we were the ones doing it, right? So I'm sitting there in the waiting room, and it's actually Bruce and I, another guy, right? We're sitting there in these chairs, and we were talking to one of the patients that was there. And what they had said was, it was a man who was there with his wife, and he said, my doctor told me one day that everything looked fine, and then something like a month later, I lost my toe. So having like a toe amputated is like a relatively common thing for progressive PAD. In fact, it's one of the leading causes of lower limb amputation, along with diabetes. And then he said, beyond that, then they had taken my foot, right? So this was like a below the knee amputation thereafter. And we kind of dived into the story, but he's like, what do you have? Because we have like this big black box, right? And we're like, oh, we're taking data, measuring blood flow. And he said, man, can I have one? We said, no, this is This is one of one. We absolutely cannot just give this to you because this is a research device. But he's like, I would have loved to have that at home. What can I pay you for it? And I mean, I know it sounds a little bit ludicrous, but it was kind of this like aha moment where it really felt like, oh, we're doing something that's important. Like people need these, and we're not going to sell direct to patients. That's not the goal here, right? But it really made us feel like we're on to something. So we felt this renewed conviction, and so it was shortly after this that we made our first pitch to find investment for the company, right? So I had put together this whole story for like what our company was going to do, and I won't bore you with all the details, but we wanted to revolutionize the treatment of peripheral artery disease on all fronts, and so we call this like the patient care continuum. So the way we diagnose PAD has problems, right? There's this test called the ankle brachial index. It's like the ratio of the blood pressure in your arm and your leg. It should be 1. If it's not, you can use that to screen patients. But it takes a long time. If you go look up the sensitivity and specificity for the ankle brachial index. It's not great. And if you have calcified arteries, which like every diabetic person does, it doesn't work well, right? So like we can help with that. We already talked about surgically, intraprocedurally, what we can do to help there. We can do that. And then for follow-up care, it's like, hey, we've got a really small device. Why don't we send this home with patients? And so rather than have a patient return to the vascular lab where they have their follow-up appointments, which, by the way, like 50% of the people just never do, right? Why don't we monitor them? Because you're either monitoring healthy people that don't need to be there, or you're monitoring people, or you never get to monitor the people that stay home and have restenosis, and you never catch them, right? So like we had this whole grand scheme thing cooked up. And on the whole, we thought we had a pretty good vision, and that pitch, and then probably a couple pitches that went thereafter, they went pretty poorly. And the reason was, even though we had a pretty grand vision, it was very narrow in focus. And so this is kind of like one of the big takeaways of there's nothing wrong with having a grand vision, but you do want to have an order of operations, and you want to have like a beachhead, which is like a beachhead market, right? In strategy. Pick the thing you want to do really well and identify why you will win in that space, right? What is your differentiator? What makes you unique? Why will you disrupt that space? And if I can sell you on that, right? If you believe in that one thing and say, yeah, there's a business there, then all this other stuff, all these secondary markets, the diagnostic market, the at-home monitoring market, I want to put it in my phone market. That's all the icing, right? But make sure that the hook, the beachhead, has value. Because if you can get someone to buy in on that, everything else, again, like I said, that's icing. So know your audience. In this case, our audience was a group of investors. They wanted to know what that beachhead was. And we thought that they'd be very interested in the technology. And I assure you, they saw 3 people with PhD after their name saying, I'm working on this thing with lasers. They do not care about the technology. They did not care. They cared about what it did. They cared about whether we had data showing it was effective and whether physicians would pay for it. Again, it's your own lived experience, right? You spend all day on technologies to figure, I need to justify this. You do, but there's other things that may be more important to justify. And secondarily, the big takeaway was cast too wide a net, right? I said this earlier. Focus on the most important part of your story. Latch on with that. No, we're good. We're turning down let's get into the evening portion of the talk. All right. So this was actually at a good time because it was around this time when we were talking to a key opinion leader, a KOL in our space, right? His name is Dr. Razavi. And he was one of the people where we were just trying to get like influencers in our space interested in the technology. And Dr. Razavi is like the quintessential key opinion leader. So like we reached out to him and said, hey, we have a technology. Are you interested in taking a look? We want to hear your feedback. And surprisingly, he responded to us, and he works at St. Joe's. He's like, come come to the lobby of St. Joe's at like 5:57 p.m. Like, I'll give you 15 minutes. I'm like, I'm not joking. That's what he said. So we ended up meeting him in the lobby. If anyone's been there, it's like next to the piano, right? And even then, when he showed up late, he was like, all right, I only have 10 minutes. Like, give me your thing, right? So we had slides. We want to talk about all these things, and there was no time for any of that, right? So it was like, all right, we took the device out, and we're like, all right, put this on. I want to show you how it works. And the demo that we'd always done was like, you put it on your finger, squeeze someone's arm. You can do it manually. You can do it with a blood pressure cuff, and you can just watch that, like, your blood flow waveform compresses, your blood flow drops to some number calibrated to 1, right? And then when you let go, it returns. So we said to him, like, hey, we've got this technology. We think we can make it cheaply. We think it could be as accurate as it needs to be. And he's like, well, what do you want to do? Diagnostics, at-home monitors? Like, no, those ideas are garbage. You want to do those first. He's like, the real value here is just how quickly this thing works. And it was something that, like, we intuitively knew, because if, like, you work on your technology, yeah, like, I've been working on laser speckle. Yeah, it works on the fly. It works basically as fast as you can capture images and process them. So it's like a value that we never saw. But he was like, watch this. So you have 2 pulmonary arteries that go into each one of your fingers. He's like, watch. So he's like sitting there, and he's occluding his finger, and then he's watching the lines go up and down. I'm like, yeah, I know. We've seen them, we've done it a million times. I know how it works. It's like, yeah, but think about this. Within the OR, I'm taking an angiographic image every 5 minutes, something like that. Like, that's the time resolution I have. So now think about a world where I can measure blood flow in real time. What if I put a balloon in an artery and I inflate it, and then I watch the value go from 10 to 7? Well, now I know that artery contributed 30% to the overall perfusion of the foot, right? What if I look at the blood flow and it's 10, I treat a lesion, and now it's up to like 13 the moment I let go, but then I see that it creeps back down afterwards due to what we call like elastic recoil. I can't see any of those things right now, but if I had your device, I could see it. And that's when it kind of like clicked. Like, that's it. Like, that's the hook, is that there was some value to the technology that we knew was there, right? But it was about, like, know your customer, like, know how they're going to use it. The thing that made it really unique and valuable, at least to Dr. Razavi, was something that we had not been paying attention to. So we went hard on this, like, interprocedural application, right? Forget diagnostics, forget at-home care. Where we're going to be really unique is interprocedurally. And so the lessons learned here is, one, a lot of us probably work on technologies which are like big and bulky, but sometimes you have the opportunity to have a hands-on. And I will say, beyond this experience and into other experiences, everyone loves PowerPoint. I love PowerPoint, right? But, like, the ability to touch and to hold and to feel and to do is worth like 1,000 words, right? So if you ever go into this game, I'll tell you, you can pitch an idea and have people be like, eh. But if you let someone, like, put it on, whatever it is, put on the watch, put on the wearable, whatever, take a measurement and, like, show them how it works, it resonates a lot harder. And then, the big takeaway, which is obvious here, is leverage the people who know the space better than you. Like, know what you know and know what you don't know. And there was something that Dr. Razavi knew that we didn't, right? And having him point that out to us made a big impact. So we refined the pitch, right? Like I said, went out, we raised some money. We were successful from there on, so we kind of refined our strategy, became better business people. And this is really where the work starts, but it's also kind of the least interesting part of the story, because it's like, you get the money, then you do the work. So the next 18 months were just work, right? Went out there, it's all the details of what you do as a medical device company. Like, we built out all the regulatory strategy, built out a quality management system. Where we didn't have the expertise, we tried to find advisors or consultants who did. Again, know what you know what you don't know, and learn what you don't know. Again, build out the QMS, do all the verification and validation, started doing even more clinical work. And ultimately, this is around the time we submitted our first 510(k) application for like the reusable version, the pulse ox looking version of our device. And that's when we got the attention of one of the big players in our space, which was Medtronic. But along the way, some lessons we certainly learned. You haven't seen the acronyms QMS before, and you're going to get into med device, like you're going to learn that acronym. Your quality management system. It's essentially like the rule book for how you build and operate a medical device company. And big companies like Medtronic have huge, onerous, slow quality management systems. But if you kind of get into this game, you want to implement that stuff because you want to do a robust job, but you want to do it as lean as possible. And you probably will. One of the bigger takeaways was the second one, which you're all looking at and probably like, yeah. Yeah, one is not 10, it's not 100, it's not 1,000, right? Like, why do I say that? Because we built a device, right? And that device worked well. And then we built 10 devices and they all worked well, but they were like a little bit different. But like, you can do that. That's pretty easy, right? And maybe 100, maybe you can build 100, but now you got to probably train other people, which means someone on a manufacturing line that has no idea what you do or how these things work, you got to train those people. Then you got to think about the tenets of repeatability and reproducibility, right? Gauge R&R, you got to start thinking about those things. And then you're going to get to scales of like 10,000. And I will tell you, this was like a hard lesson that we learned, that Bernard was too generous in my touch a laser diode and it works thing, because when you start getting to big numbers, we bought 25,000 laser diodes, right? And it's very easy to think in the beginning that like, oh yeah, well, laser diodes, I buy them, they have a spec sheet, they should operate the same. But it was a hard lesson that you buy 1,000 laser diodes, they might all come from the same lot. You buy 25,000 laser diodes, well, they might even come from the same lot, but guess what? They come from different dies, and they come from different sections of the same die. So like the threshold current where it starts to laze, well, that starts to change a little bit. The performance starts to change. So you start thinking, oh, lot to lot variability of this part, which I assume, which is always the same because it comes with a spec sheet. Not a scale to 25,000, it doesn't. But these are like hard lessons that you'll learn. So don't start with those problems. Those are good problems, right? You got to sell 25,000 things before it becomes a problem. But it is a lesson to think about that what works on a small scale doesn't necessarily scale up in a way that you think. And then I'm going to hit this last point home. Clinical data, man, when we were taking clinical data at this stage, it was so easy. We spent on the order of like thousands of dollars to interface with physicians and universities, right, to take this data. The price tag of the very first clinical study that I ran at Medtronic was 5 orders of magnitude larger, right? So keep that in mind. Like that's a lot of space in your wallet that you can keep.
So one of the things that I say in the lab is sometimes like, when we're building something is, even if it looks very janky or it's like people that are much smarter than us and that have more skill can make this at scale. Basically they could scale up on this. So is that the wrong thing to be saying? Like based on what you're saying about, or is that something I should be thinking about earlier? Or is that?
No, I think jank has value. I'm like a firm believer in jank. I think it's more around the idea that you can't take that really immature prototype and just assume like, oh, sure, it's just going to be easy to scale up to millions, right? It's not that the early stage, I say like the spit and duct tape and bubble gum prototypes, right? Like for sure, I'm a firm believer in that. It's just understanding that the road to say someone can do it, surely it's easy. Like when I buy 1,000 of these, the 1,000th one's going to work the same as the first. It's not true. You'll find a lot of problems. So it's not about avoiding the jank. It's about just anticipating and trying to foresee the unknown unknowns. And there were a lot of those for us. So it's more just appreciation for it's not so simple as getting to 1,000. You can, and I think that's the right way to think, that it can't be that hard. And it's usually not because like, oh, other people can't figure it out. It's because there's just these little nuances of you got to think about how many can you make in a day? Like am I going to run 3 shifts, 8-hour shifts? Like how am I going to make sure that I do all the V&V to get there? It'll get you. But like you have to get to that problem of making thousands before it becomes a problem. So it's like This is a saying which I talk about with my friend Bruce a lot, which is like solve the problems you know you have, not the problems you think you might have, right? Focus on those. All right, so we were talking to Medtronic at that point. Another question?
Quick question. Can you go back a couple of slides? There, yeah, in the last point, what amount of clinical data do you have to acquire, let's say, to uh, verify that the technology was working, or that I don't know, to get some approval from an institution or something like that?
Yeah. It's going to be a really unsatisfying answer to your question because it's highly dependent on what you're trying to do and the
Okay.
indications you want,
Mhm.
right? So let's just take the FDA, for example, and let's assume you're going to make a device and there's different pathways, right? But the two most common pathways are going to be a 510(k) pathway, which is like you've got an equivalent product, right? You're substantially equivalent to something else. Or there's a PMA. PMA, like the more onerous kind of class 3 product. So it used to be that you could answer that and say for a 510(k), sometimes you don't need any clinical data at all. That is still true in the vast minority of times. But more likely, you're going to need on the order of like 10 to hundreds of patients of data to submit with a 510(k). And to be honest, it may not be vastly more than that for a PMA, but a lot of the times, like the endpoints become more cumbersome and complicated. So it's not that the trials themselves enroll more people, that's what makes it hard. The depth of the data and the number of sites and the robustness of the analysis can make some of those trials more expensive. So unsatisfying answer, on the order of probably tens to hundreds. It's rare for you to need thousands of patients of data.
Okay, and in all these several different cases, it's like when you are small, it's easier.
Yes,
Okay.
everything is easier when you're smaller.
Okay.
All right. I had mentioned earlier we had these talks ongoing with Medtronic at the time, right? So they continue to go, and we get to a point where we had just got the clearance on this first device, and Medtronic had said, if you get that clearance, we're gonna sign up for this set of definitive agreements, which is just kind of like fancy business person speak for we're gonna set out several different agreements of different categories. So one is going to be what's called like a joint steering agreement, which means that we are going to work together to set the strategies and the objectives of the business together. They don't get to control your decisions, right? But they have some degree of oversight of what you do. It's called like a board observer seat. And as a result, they will put some additional funding into the business, which they did. So this was like tranche 2 of funding. And then we started distributing the reusable portion. We're not creative namers, right? So it's FlowMet R for reusable. We're not rocket scientists. So we were not selling it ourselves. We were making it, right? And according to the FDA, like we were the manufacturer of record, but then we distribute through Medtronic. And part of that distribution was doing this like independent study where we give devices to Medtronic, Medtronic can sell them to customers, and then Medtronic can set up agreements where they can observe how the customers use them and glean their feedback. And so I'm going to talk about that in a second, but that's when I kind of complete out this thought. So we did that, and then we started working on like the next generation of our product, which was just a disposable version of the same thing. So instead of think of like a pulse ox, right? Everyone's seen like the reusable pulse ox, but you've seen like the Massimo single-use disposable adhesive one. It was like, do that. It's a little more complicated when you're trying to build in like a CMOS camera and a laser and all that stuff, but that was the goal, right? So we did that. We built it, validated it, verified it, cleared it through the FDA, and that's ultimately what was like this milestone for saying that Medtronic had the option to acquire the company. They exercised that option, and they did. But there's kind of a learning point in all of this, which is in this independent study portion, because this is where things actually got kind of contentious, and I think it's just an interesting tidbit of the story. So it goes like this. We did technology. We believed in the technology. We believed that it worked. We believed that it provided value. We weren't the kind of people that needed to we needed to put like fancy bells and whistles on something because it didn't look good on its own merits, right? And so what Medtronic had said to us at the time was that they wanted to take our devices, they wanted to explicitly exclude us from being in the OR, and they wanted to run a study and get feedback, and they wanted to do all the analysis themselves in isolation, and then make a decision based upon what they saw. And as an engineer or scientist, that may not sound all that, interesting or confrontational or dangerous, but from a business perspective, you like never let your baby out without you being there to oversee it. And it's not just because you may not believe that it works, but it's like, you can be amazed the way that people will try and use things in a way you didn't intend, right? Like, this is not a telephone, but like someone will use it as one if you give it to someone who doesn't know how to use it. And so those things just happen. And if you're not there to say, oh, this is happening because of reason A, B, C. No. Well, when the little receiver goes in the hole right here, like you don't cram it into the laser aperture, but like that will happen. Like people will do that. So there's good reason why. But this became like a bit of a rift in the company at that time, in our company, because every advisor and every investor at this point was like, do not sign up for this because nothing good will come of it. People will wreck it. And at this point, we knew the people who were going to be running the study. They were engineers. They were scientists like us. At some point, like I'd thrown out the term photon banana because we were talking about like light diffusion. And they loved that. Like they were nerds like we were, right? So I was like, no, I think that they'll get it. And so we didn't usually disagree with our investors or our board. In this case, we did. And ultimately, like it ended up being favorable. And I think it's because we found the right people to work with. And I think that we had a technology that we believed in. But, one of the big lessons then, I'm going to jump to like the last bullet point was, if you get down this road and you start dealing with big companies, because now I'm part of a big company, right? If you act in a way that's full of lack of transparency and caginess, like those things are mirrored back upon you. So if you're the kind of person that's like, I gotta do a song and a dance to be there, to not, as they say, like don't open the kimono, right? But it's like it's this metaphor for not showing like everything is in there, like good, bad, and ugly, right? And I think if you act in that way, you'll find that other people generally tend to just kind of like recapitulate your behavior. Like if you're open and transparent, people are a bit disarmed and they'll deal with you open and transparently.
Yeah, so you mentioned that you basically found people who kind of resonate with you, the engineers.
Yeah.
So what happens if you don't have those people? It seems to be in a contract or it seems to be in the agreement that you need to do this from the Medtronic perspective, but you're dealing with the other side, the investor saying, no, don't do this. So
Yeah.
what is your decision?
Well, that's a really good question. There's another tough lesson learned here. So with your investors, it's easy, right? You can disagree with your investor or your board, and then you vote, right? And you make a decision, you move on, and that's at your discretion. I will say, in this case, we were the ones to make the decision, so we could kind of guide that. And I think we found these people, like you said, who kind of mirrored the way that we were, so we felt comfortable making that. I've worked with other people who were the other phenotype that you're describing, which is like they act in a way which is definitely lacking transparency. You never feel like you're getting the full truth. I would not encourage people to act without transparency, but I would be more guarded in that situation because there are people who will take advantage of that. Maybe not overtly, right? But you can end up being on the losing end. So I'd still try and act with transparency, but if someone comes to you and they're acting cagey, there may be a reason for that. So don't go spilling the beans right off the bat. I'd be more guarded with it. All right. We're towards the end here. So lessons learned. This is like a reiteration of what I said earlier, know thy customer. I had an advisor early on in the company who, I don't know, we were like a couple years in, and he's like, who's your customer? And I said, what do you mean who's my customer? Like, we're selling to hospitals. Hospitals are the customer. And he was like, wrong. They're not your customer. And I was like, all right. His name was also Bruce. Bruce, who's my customer? He's like, the investors are your customer. Right now, you're not selling anything. You are trying to raise money, and your investors are the customer. And I kind of laughed because I was like, yeah, okay. But now looking back upon that, I think there was actually some real wisdom in that comment, which is that your customer is going to change. Sure, and it's not always in the pure sense of business either. Like your customer could be your family, where you're trying to like sell an idea to them. You're trying to get them interested in something you're doing. I go to business meetings all the time where I have my strategic leadership that I have to pitch to. I have to justify my budget every single year. I need to justify hiring a new person, a new seat in a new building, right? They are the customer, and knowing what their pain points are, knowing what resonates with them, and knowing how to speak to them is really important. And I think this kind of gets the idea of like communication and presentation and being able to articulate your ideas. I get that question a lot, which is like, what makes a good engineer? What makes a good entrepreneur? And I'll talk about that in a second. But if you can't know your audience and present clearly and make it known what you're trying to convey to them, you're going to get very little back. It's like a core skill. And I think without it, it's very easy to stagnate within this field and otherwise. Lastly, or second to lastly, you already kind of brought this point, right? Which is like, I think we made a lot of good inroads with the technology that we built. I think we made something that worked. I think it filled an important niche, but ultimately, like our relationships were formed with the value of the technology. But ultimately, the reason why I think we ended up closing the deal, selling it, was due to the relationships. And it was due to the relationships with people that we formed because we tried to deal with them transparently. We found people that were like us. And so no one's gonna like buy what you're selling if you just like show up there and say, let's do it. And then people in the room are like, sounds good, I'm gonna buy it. The conversation that happens where the decision is made is when you leave the room and everyone sits at the table and have the conversation when you're not there. So then you need a champion. Like you need someone that's bought into your idea who will defend it when you are not there. And so that's why relationships are important. Because like your idea has value, but having someone who can be there in the room proselytizing your idea that's not you is really impactful. And I've already talked about the third one. All right, closing thoughts, because we're kind of at this in this talk, this confluence of like an academic bent plus entrepreneurialism plus what my life is now, which is like early stage R&D. And I've been thinking about this because I do a lot of interviews now at this point in my life, and people ask like, what makes a good early stage R&D engineer? Like what would make me effective on your team? And I thought about like, what are the common themes that I see between things that make you effective as an academic researcher or a graduate student individual, as an entrepreneur or an early stage R&D? And like, there's a lot of variation here, right? So bear with me, broad strokes. But I think the one thing that I see that's like a common trait that tends to be successful in all of them is what I would say this quality of embracing specifically ambiguous and challenging problems, and then having the passion, the dedication, and the audacity to attempt to solve them. Problem solving. It's all about problem solving. In grad school, right, like you are by your very nature, you're going out and you're trying to understand something that no one else does. That is the point. Similarly, in entrepreneurialism, you're starting a company, you're trying to make something that's never been made before, probably, right? There's no one there to tell you what to do. The road is often opaque. And then lastly, in early stage R&D, we're just looking for the problems to solve. And then it's like, PAD, what's the right solution? What's the right technology to the problem? Well, no one can tell you, because if they could, it would have already been done. So in every case, it's kind of all the same variations on the same theme, which is if you can be the kind of person to look at a problem like that, not be bothered by the ambiguity and the challenge of it, and just be really interested in trying to solve problems in a way that speaks to your passion and your perseverance. And I think to some degree, audacity, like in the positive sense of the word, like the bravery to do it. I think that drives success in all three of those categories. All right, and that's it. So thanks everyone for bearing with me through the whole thing.
Hi, thank you for your talk. What does it mean when a company buys out your product? Like, what are the details behind that? Does that just mean that they provide you and your team with a hefty check and give you a position at the company as like the lead of that project, or is it different than that?
Yeah, it's highly variable. It just depends on the structure of the deal. And so I'll give you some examples to make it more concrete, right? You can buy a company and you can say, we're going to basically change the sign on the wall that's like, you're now Science Co., not anymore. Like now you're Boston Scientific. And that company now needs to take on all of the processes of the new mother company, right? I said the QMS before, right? Like they've got rules and regulations they operate by, but you can operate that company almost like a subsidiary. Like that's fine. Some people do that. And the way that would be, the reason you might do it to be successful is maybe it's in a market that you are very unfamiliar with that you don't do in your day to day, right? So if I'm like a company that does pulse oximetry and I buy an AirPod company or something, like maybe long term I want to be in that, but they probably know how to operate in that space and I don't. So I may want to just let them keep on doing their thing. The other flavor would be like the opposite, which is a tuck-in acquisition. And it's called like tuck-in because that company is doing something that you already know. Our company was a tuck-in because I didn't get into all the details, but we operate in the cath lab. The hospitals that we were selling to, they generally serve interventional cardiologists, interventional radiologists, and vascular surgeons. So Medtronic already sells to all those people. They already sell products in that category. So they're like, this is just another thing in our bag. And so we're going to pull you in, and yeah, you're going to work for us now, but you're essentially now just like you're part of the family, right? And there's pros and cons to both, but it can be those two things and everything in between. There is no definitive structure.
Okay, thank you. And also, did you reach out to Medtronic, or was it like they found you in your work?
Yeah, it was, I guess, neither. And this is what I would suggest is like, it means a lot if you have a champion, which I think I alluded to earlier, right? So in our case, we met with a physician, a key opinion leader. It was Dr. Razavi, who I alluded to earlier, right? He was on Medtronic's scientific advisory board meeting, right? So he was like, he's already the person they go to say like, hey, anything interesting out there? And it carries way more weight for someone like that to say, you should check out this technology. Even if they're saying, I'm not so sure about it, but you should take a look, as opposed to like the number of people who are going to knock on the door of Philips or Boston or J&J and say like, you got a really good idea. Like you're one of a billion who do that, right? But if instead they have someone who's a known article and they're trusted and they say like, maybe you should go look at this, whatever technology, you've already kind of bypassed 3 layers of bureaucracy to get there. And that's what we did.
Hi, thank you for your talk. This was super interesting. I'm very interested in going into industry, but also maybe startup culture. So it was cool to see that progression. Can you talk more about we joked about the jankiness. I feel like in an academic lab, everything is a little janky
Yeah.
when you're prototyping. So can you talk more about that progression from the first prototype to the prototype that you used to really start getting that funding? Because you also kind of alluded to navigating the IP landscape as well. Can you just speak more on that?
Yeah. I will say, I won't torture everyone by going back in the slides. Our investors did not really care all that much about what the jank factor of the prototype was. They cared about the data, right? But I think this kind of goes to like Bernard's point, which is they knew that it's this big now. Like spend some time, bring it down to be this big, and if you can make it this big, you can probably make it that big, right? And so they honestly. I make this sound easier than it was, but I think there's some validity to it, which is like you are going to know more technically than they will ever know, right? So if you have enough credibility in your space, when we went to our investors and we said, you know, we think that we can meet these specifications in this particular size. If they want to do deep due diligence, they'll go find that out. But like by and large, like you probably know and they don't. And they're going to be more concerned with kind of the big, more strategic business ideas for like, does this market actually exist? Will people actually buy it? Do people actually care? Is it disruptive? Do you have a go-to-market model? What does the revenue model look like? Are you an engineer who's never built out a market model before? Probably. Like they're going to be more focused on those types of things. Because for us, like the IP and the technology was always the easy part because it's like it's three people with PhD after the name who came from the Beckman Laser Institute. So like I'm pretty sure they can do laser stuff. I'm focused on the everything else.
Thank you.
So kind of building up on that, how important was the patent?
Was the patent?
Yeah.
Yeah. Very is the short answer. But why? It was important, maybe not for the reason you would think, because I think the natural thing is like, well, did people come in and try and challenge your patent? Not for that reason, but because ultimately, like when you're thinking about your value as a company, you only have certain things that are like tangible value to you, right? And so even when I talked about this like investment from Medtronic, there is some sort of like security to the investment, right? So it just means like what's like your collateral against it. We had debt-based financing. So the patent ended up being really important in that study because of course Medtronic went out and they had someone look at it and assess like the strength of the claims. So they wanted to make sure it wasn't a garbage patent because you can go and write a garbage patent and even get claims, but if they're just so narrow, it doesn't matter, right? And someone will do that. There's a lot of people that are savvy on patents, a lot of people who will take your money to write good patents. So it was important because at some point, like we just had some clinical data and we had a bunch of lasers in a lab. Like there wasn't a lot of pure capital value. And so the patent became like collateral against some other things. Like it served as the asset for a long time until we had something more important, which was a big clinical study result that we could point to. But up until that point, it's kind of like the unspoken value of your company. And people will go, microscopic on that. If things had gone further, I'm sure we'd get into like patent litigation and things like that too. We know of at least one person that looked at our patent and then didn't make certain decisions because of it. So it did have a lot of value, but not because we went to court.
So this is a little bit of a kind of a meta question here, but so when you were a grad student, one of the things that I was convinced about was Sean's he's definitely going to go the academic route. And he disappointed me, no, I'm kidding. He went the entrepreneurial route. And so we've had panels earlier this week on entrepreneurship. We had one today on academic, and which I think you have qualifications to be able to say something about that as well. And then, now you're in industry. And so you're actually kind of you're a rarity in the sense that you could actually speak on all three of these topics here. So you showed a little bit like what's the commonality amongst people kind of in these three different spaces. I guess, do you have anything you want to say to the trainees here about like, what directions that people might want to consider leaning into depending on certain things that they're thinking?
Ooh, yeah, it's a good question. I didn't go into grad school thinking I wanted to be an entrepreneur. That was not a vision. I actually remember the exact moment, and I still tell this story, and I'm not sure if I've ever said this to Bernard before. Maybe I have. I remember the exact moment where this like inflection point happened of like, this is something I want to try out. Because I went to Bernard when I was in the lab, and I had like jotted down this little note with an idea, and you had said, that's interesting. You should dig into that. Maybe like look into a patent about it. And that was literally the thing that snowballed into like the entirety of my future. So I give Bernard credit because he absolutely deserves it. And that was the impetus. But I didn't. The point of this is, one, to call out Bernard because he gave birth to all of this. But two, I didn't have some grand vision. I didn't know going in. And so in retrospect, why would I go into the entrepreneurial space? I think that there's a lot of really interesting applied problems in the entrepreneurial space, and that was very satisfying for me. And what I've also found is that there were other elements that I found satisfying in terms of like metrics of success, right? Like I wanted to do something that I could build personally, that I felt some ownership over. If that resonates with you, think about it. If you're someone that's really, if you're early in your life, meaning that like maybe you don't have kids, maybe you want to travel, maybe you can work long hours. Like, unfortunately, being an entrepreneur, it demands a lot of those things, right? So there's a flexibility in the early part of your career that you may have, may not be aware of it, that you may not have later on in your life. And so as a grad student, you're usually used to like eating pizza and living on $100 a month or whatever, right? And so you're used to that transition to being an entrepreneur because it's like more of the same. And if you're just interested in things beyond just like the pure science, it's absolutely an outlet for that. I never envisioned getting into building market miles and working on business strategy and doing due diligence on companies. But that's basically the thrust of what I do now. And it's become satisfying. And I think, not to say this is how you should feel, but I've also just found that there were things that I found that I was good at, that I excelled at, just outside of my academic career. I very quickly learned that I'm not the strongest engineer. I'm not the smartest person in the room. Like I'm not the best at many things, right? But where I found my strength is that I can be proficient at academia. I can be proficient at engineering, but I can also be pretty proficient at working on corporate strategy or putting together our annual operating budget or things like that. And so the ability to take complex ideas and to be able to communicate them clearly to people who are not in academia, who are investors, who are the president of my business at Medtronic, to be able to take something complex and be able to boil it down to 3 points and to say, this is what you need to know and this is why it's important. I came to find that like that was something that I was stronger at than other engineers. And so if you find that you also have some of those abilities for communication, I know it doesn't sound like a very intuitive way of saying why you would get into entrepreneurialism, but consider it, because it's like if you find yourself being more of a jack of all trades, I think you'll find that if you go into the entrepreneurial side of things, there's a million jobs to be done. There's quality jobs, there's regulatory jobs, there's CEO jobs, there's toilet scrubber jobs. Like I've done all of those things. And if you can wear all those hats, it becomes a really strong asset to you.
So you talked about the importance of a professional network and maintaining a good relationship, right? And obviously the nature of a good relationship within academia and entrepreneurship is going to be different. So I guess my question to you is, what do you consider a good network in a sense, and how do you maintain it? Because at least for me as a student, I'm often told like follow as many people and connect as many people as you can in LinkedIn. But I feel like if you're gonna do a startup, I just don't feel like just having a LinkedIn connection is enough, obviously, right?
Yeah.
So I guess I just want to ask you, what is your definition of a good professional network and how do you maintain that?
Yeah, I don't know if there's some metric of like 25 people is good, but I would definitely agree with your sentiment that like connecting with people on LinkedIn, it's not about like, can I send this person a message? It's like, do they know your name? Like, do they know what you're good at? Do they know what you're interested in? Because I will say, like, I was thinking about it from my perspective on the other side now, right? Like every so often, I go and conduct interviews and trying to hire people for the team. And like, who do I think of, right? I generally go and I think back to all the people that I've met at networking events. And like the things that I think of are like, what skills you have? Who were you? Were you passionate? Did you care? Were you willing to grow? Would you be a good fit for the team? like none of those things exist on LinkedIn. Or they're probably on your profile somewhere, right? But like no one's going to remember that. So it is the person, it sounds maybe old fashioned, right? But like it is the personal relationships. And so what is a good network? I think it's people who can not just remember you, but they can remember you for something. Like what do you do? What are you good at? Or if you have technology, like what did your thing do? That to me is the network, because that's ultimately how we were successful. Like we had someone who saw our technology and was able to say, hey, Medtronic, it doesn't need to be Medtronic, it could be anyone, right? You should take a look at that, right? But it was only because we went there, we showed up in person and put the device on. If we had just sent a message and say, we got this spectacular thing that measures blood flow and it does, it's like we would have gone nowhere, right? And so I'm not trying to devalue LinkedIn, but I do think to get to your question was like, what's a good network? I think that goes beyond the screen. I think the personal relationships of, hey, can we get coffee? Let's talk. I just want to meet you. Those are the people that I remember now, right? And that's where you would want to be too, right?
Hi. Thanks, Sean. I'm Michael, and I actually had a very similar career path with you. So I also got a degree, started a company acquired, and now I'm also working in a big company. Right? Now I'm working in Intuitive. So
That's a cool company.
here I'm going to throw some hard questions. Okay. So when you look, I mean, first of all, a lot of things I found echoes from your presentation. Like it reminds me my first business plan, my first pitch, when I scale up, made a lot of learn a lot of new things, made a lot of problems. So here's the question. When you look back, is there any moment that you just don't believe this gonna work out? Either from a financial pressure or like technology, you just can't product doesn't work, or even if maybe failed in the field, right? So
Oh yeah.
during that moment, I'm not sure if you have or not, maybe not.
Oh man, so
but
it's not like is there one? It's like I gotta look through my library of things.
like how do you get that mind power to really continue this and instead of barely giving up?
Yeah. All right. Were there times? Yeah, there was one of those times was definitely where we were working on signing some definitive agreements, right? So we're trying to like sign a deal, right? And so what happened was part of that deal was getting our next tranche of funding. And so we're quickly running out of money. We've been very transparent about that. And we got to the point where when you're negotiating and you're out of money, the other side can see that you're out of money. So they know that your level of desperation will grow. And so we sensed that, right? And so there was a point where I think we went with the founders, basically, we like gave up our salary for months to not run out of money. We had one employee who we continued to pay. And so the one point I remember being really desperate is when like we were, as founders, like it's our thing, right? We essentially own the majority of the company. If we need to go without a paycheck, we can go without a paycheck. But I remember saying like, there's someone we pay, right? Like their livelihood depends on us, and we're running out of money to pay that person. And what am I going to sign up for? What am I going to agree to? And then look that person in the eyes and say, either we took a bad agreement because I want to pay you, or we can't pay you anymore because we need a better deal. And that may never actually bear fruit down the road. That was really hard.
Yeah.
And it just so like, how did you get through it? Man, I don't think I could have done it alone. I think it was just that I had a really good network of friends who were supportive. And I have a really good partner, my wife, who is like, you can do it. We believe in you. Because there were times when like you just lose some of that. You lose it. And another time was we had a device. It was actually during that clinical trial I was telling you about that we kind of like did at risk. And man, that's like you've seen every failure mode of your technology you think could conceivably happen, right? So this device got sent off to Jackson, Mississippi. And I think we sent like 3 because we're like, all right, one's going to die in transit because someone drops it off a truck, and like someone's going to break. And I got a phone call. I was like at work, And like, we're seeing this error code and I'd never seen it before. It's giving me crazy values. I'm like, all right, well, unplug it, or plug it back in. I could not explain what had happened, which was surprising because like I had broken this thing every way I thought was conceivable. And I remember just being so beaten down after that conversation because that felt like everything that could have gone wrong, I feel like I've compensated for, and something else went wrong. And you start saying like, have I done a good enough job on like, did I make a bad product? Is this reliable? And, to be honest, it was just like there was no other option. Like the option is you're either going to keep on doing it and fight the battle the next day, or you're going to pack up your stuff and go home and everybody loses. And I think that's what it was, honestly. I wish there was a better answer to that, but I think it was there. Like you get to these points where there's no way out but through. Like that is the only thing you do, or you give up, right? And like I'm not going to go home to my wife and be like, I had this dream and it was really cool, but then I gave up on it because it was bad. And so, like you're accountable to yourself, and sometimes you get in the dumps because things go wrong. And if you have good support around you, hopefully they can pull you out. But ultimately, it's your baby. I think one of the things I didn't include in here is like nobody cares about the thing as much as you do, right? So if you're looking for other people to, your investors, your board, whatever, you've been through this, like nobody cares about your thing as much as you ever do, right? So at some point, like lick your wounds, get up, and you just got to be like the only way to do it is to push through because no one will do it but you because nobody cares as much as you do.
Thanks. That's very, very amazing answers. Thanks.
Jen, we'll have Jen ask the last question.
Sean, great talk. How did you get along with Bruce and Tyler?
We don't talk anymore. I texted Bruce today, probably multiple times. Bruce asked if I wanted protein bars from Grocery Outlet, so I'd say we're still pretty good friends. Tyler, interestingly enough, obviously we're still very good friends. I was joking earlier that I was at his bachelor party when I was snowboarding last, and I broke my rib because my namesake of other Shaun White, the other one, we do not see eye to eye on level of coordination. Great guy, and Tyler actually went on, found another company after this one. So the only divergence has been that like the career path we've taken after the acquisition has changed, and we still contemplate from time to time of like, do we want to get the band back together? And we've given that some consideration. So it's that's like, yeah. How do we get along? It was easy is not the right word, but it helped in that we had very divergent personalities. So I would describe it this way. Tyler, from a risk perspective, very liberal. Go, go, go. Take all the risks. Do all the things. Bruce is the other end of the spectrum where what I say to Bruce is he has perfection paralysis, which is so caught up on getting it perfect that you stay here forever because it needs to be right, and you do it to your own detriment where you make no progress because you can't get out of that hole. And I'm somewhere in the middle. And it helped that there's three of us. So at the front end, the board was three people, right? And so you vote. Everything was a vote. And even the way we divided the company was equally. And honestly, that was kind of the magic, is like everyone was equal, everyone had value, but at the end of the day, we had to vote. And it was usually Bruce is on one side, Tyler's over here, and then I had to make the decision. And I hope it was right. But I do think, to make this a more material, meaningful answer, none of that would work if we didn't respect each other, right? Tyler, for being more, he was not the risk-averse type, right? He was prone to risk. But he was the best physicist, and he was the best at writing software. He was great at identifying problems and just going out there, putting himself out there. That wasn't me at the time, right? In the same way that Bruce could grind on paperwork for hours and hours. And this is the thing that I say today, which is like, nobody's better than the work. And when we had to submit our 510K application, it was like 2,000 pages. And at this point, you had to submit it in paper to the FDA. Like, guess who was in the office at 2 a.m. 3-hole punching paper on this like high school 3-hole puncher that I got that does like 10 pages at a time? Bruce and I, right? Because that's who he is. And that's not everybody. So I think it's all to say that we didn't always agree on things, but I think we respected what the other person was good at. And if you can do that and you see that everyone has their unique value, you can get by the fights. Because if we fight, yes. But you get past it. It's like a good marriage, right?
Okay, with that, thank you so much, John, for a wonderful.